conference. My name is Mapira, and I'm from here, from Cornerstone. I'm an academic and I'm a sociologist. I think I should actually make myself clear in terms of what my ideological and theoretical orientations are for this presentation to make much more sense. Okay. I'm a sociologist, so what I'm going to be presenting is from a sociological perspective. I'm not just a sociologist, but a Marxist sociologist. So community engagement is very important from a Marxist sociological perspective, because from the inception of sociology, the debate was, we are interpreting society and understand society, social phenomena and social problems, but changing it, we are failing, right? So Karl Marx actually said that, in the 1800s, when sociology was developing as a discipline, we need to interpret society and change it. So community engagement has been at the center of debates about the direction sociology as a discipline should take. So the title of the presentation is Deploying the Pedagogy of Community-Engaged Scholarship in Pursuit of Sustainable Alternative Development in South Africa. Why sustainable alternative development in South Africa? I'll be very critical as a critical sociologist that mainstream neoliberal development has failed, by many measures, right? Poverty and inequality in post-apartheid South Africa has increased. Unemployment and many other social problems. And is this not the time for us to reimagine development, to think about development different and experiment with other potential models of development? So I will argue that, yes, we need to pursue development alternatives. But I will explain later what those development alternatives mean with examples. So engaged scholarship is nothing new, as I said. Almost every higher education institution has some kind of engaged scholarship going on. Some institutions have actually gone to the extent of institutionalizing and operationalizing community engagement. For example, some universities have centers for community engagement. That's, for example, UWC and UCT. Some colleges and universities do community engagement on an ad hoc basis. It's not like something that is institutionalized, like an everyday practice, but they do that as an ad hoc practice. So I'm going to say that I'm quite critical of neoliberal development, top-down development, and that there could be a lot of people here who are who are fans of the neoliberal capitalist development. They'll probably feel a bit unsettled by my critique, because the discussion will start with explaining mainstream development and everything that is wrong with mainstream development at the moment, and then why we need to be thinking about alternative development models and experimenting with alternative development models, and then situate the debate on community engagement within that. Because I believe that community engagement is important for us to actually bring to life, to amplify those development alternatives that has been relegated to the fringes of mainstream academia, that have been regarded as unintelligible, regarded as not worthwhile, and because they do not fall squarely within the purview of what development is, right? So basically that's the topic today. My apologies. There we go. Okay, great. So I'll start with development as a contested discourse. There is no one path for all in terms of development, but rather a multiplicity of ideas in terms of what development is and ought to be. But in reality today, right, the mainstream neoliberal capitalist development is the dominant development discourse and practice. If I ask any of you what development is, right, your narratives, or rather your responses, fall squarely within neoliberal capitalist development, right? You'll be talking about industrial development, job creation, infrastructure, technology, the fourth industrial revolution. You'll be talking about high income, right? We'll be talking about everything Western, right? Because it's a development model that actually originated within the Western historical context, and then it developed across or rather it's spread across the whole world, through imperialism and colonialism. Right? So that's how we understand development today, right? Even if you read the policies, the government policies from GEAR, which was implemented in 1996, to the current National Development Program, they're pretty much, it pretty much falls within neoliberal capitalist development. So development is articulation between power and knowledge, that is recycled in terms of the discourse. So the mainstream neoliberal development approach remains the dominant hegemonic development discourse. Everything else is seen as not development proper, is seen as not worthwhile, right? So the Western neoliberal capitalist development is what we consider today as development, but it's now being challenged by other development models. They are socialist models, right? Even communism, right? There's community development today, which actually began in the 1980s, after the realization that communities have a role to play in their own development, not just as development recipients of development services, but actually people who are capable of shaping their own development, right? There are many alternatives, economies of difference, right? If you read Gibson and Graham 2005, they talk about economies of difference, a mixed economy, right, with both traditional livelihoods and modern, capitalist economic activities. And I'll show you with an example what that means. So there are many examples. There's also, indigenous knowledge and practices when it comes to development, right? Indigenous development. So there's multiplicity of ideas when it comes to development. Be that as it may, the mainstream neoliberal development remains the development trajectory that many countries today follow, right? Yes, so despite the contestation, neoliberal development remains the dominant and hegemonic development discourse and practice. Other competing discourses and practices are relegated to the fringes of mainstream academia and development policy and implementation. They are largely regarded as unintelligible, unscientific, primitive, and outside the purview of development. But they hold so much promise in terms of democracy, sustainable, and inclusive development. And I'll show you examples how this is actually possible, right? There are many communities, for example, in the Mpondo and Wild Coast, in what we now call the Eastern Cape, right? They've been resisting the government's attempts to impose mining, which falls squarely within mainstream neoliberal development, in favor of their own development. They literally say, we don't want your development, we have our own development. And it's actually sustainable environmentally, right? And it empowers the local people because they own their own land, right? Through cooperatives, they're able to actually develop together, right? And shared development. Through ecotourism, they're able to actually, also bring extra income for the communities, right? So there are many alternatives to mainstream, but in the academia, we are not paying attention to that. So that actually brings to the fore the role of engaged scholarship. It's our role as scholars, as students, as development experts now to engage communities with a view to understand these emerging development alternatives and bring them to the fore or bring them to life, right, as part and parcel of the mainstream academia. So that's the argument I'm going to be making in this presentation. Right, so I think I jumped. Okay, so community engagement, where does community engagement fit into this debate about, mainstream development and competing development alternatives? As I said, as students of development, as development experts, community activists, environmental activists, we need to engage more with communities so that we understand what development means from the perspective of those who live the reality of poverty and inequality, and to understand their models of development and intellectualize development so that we are able to move beyond mainstream neoliberal development and we move towards more sustainable community-driven development. And community engagement, or rather community engaged scholarship, is nothing new, right? It's something that has been theorized quite a lot. It has been explored by various scholars, and there is no, I would say, reservations whatsoever about its importance. Everyone, as a matter of principle, agrees with the idea of community engagement, and many universities are institutionalizing community engagement. And yeah, so there's general consensus amongst all of us that community engagement is imperative, it's important today more than ever, right? But despite the appreciation of the university's active role in socioeconomic development through community engagement scholarship and attempts on institutionalized community engaged scholarship, higher education institutions continue to pay a lip service to deploying community engaged scholarship. Most universities today do have some kind of institutionalization of community engaged scholarship, but it's mostly on an ad hoc basis. It's not something that we are religiously pursuing as academics. In most cases, maybe it's a requirement, especially for professional degrees such as social work, community development, where you're actually required to have a practical kind of component to your curriculum, right? But outside that, many social science disciplines, it's always up to the students and their supervisors to engage with communities. So there's widespread community resistance to neoliberal development in South Africa, and the search for development alternatives, or the so-called development from below, which is development driven by the community members. The impetus for development is emerging from the communities themselves, and they are the drivers of their own development. And they are also resisting the government's development impositions. We have seen this with the Olobeni mining saga. We have seen this with the explosion of various social movements from the year 2000 to present, right? With the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee, the anti-eviction campaigns, the anti-privatization forums, all those social movements, right? They represent this resistance to neoliberal impositions, and they're actually advocating for alternative community-driven development trajectories. So this presentation advocates for the pedagogy of community-engaged scholarship in pursuit of development from below and in support of grassroots social movements. By grassroots social movements, we refer to various social, community-based organizations, NGOs, development agencies. We are talking about social movements, right? And all anti-establishment movements that are challenging, policy and practice in South Africa and beyond. So, for us to intellectualize and bring to the fore these development alternatives, we need to engage with the communities to understand from their perspective what development is and ought to be, and the voices of the poor people themselves matter in development, rather than us as academics, as researchers, as scholars, sitting in the comfort of our offices, or rather in our lecture rooms, and conceptualizing development. Right? Development should be understood from the actor's point of view, from the experience of those who live the reality. Okay, so why should we have community engaged scholarship in pursuit of development alternatives? It's because of the failure of the current development trajectory, right? There are challenges with the mainstream development. We all have been led to believe, and I totally understand. I myself had to go through a very painful process of unlearning quite a lot of things that I was taught. And one of those things is that neoliberal capitalism works. What's good for multinational corporations is good for me and other citizens of this country. What's good for the markets is good for me, but alas, it's actually not always the case, right? Markets, multinational corporations, when left to their own devices, they serve the interests of their shareholders, right? Profit making, right? So the mainstream neoliberal development is found wanting on many measures of development, right? Trickle-down economics, right? I'll give an example of South Africa. I think our economy had been growing exponentially, or right on average, it was growing, I think, maybe 2 to 3% growth rate up to the 2010 World Cup. Then things started going south, right? But when it was growing, right, it did not translate into measurable, development indicators for the people, right? Unemployment was growing, an economy that was growing but shedding jobs, right? That's very, peculiar. That's very, it's kind of a paradox. Mainstream development, once believed to be the prescription for economic growth in the third world, has in fact resulted in high inequality, and the gap between the rich and poor has actually increased, right? So it's a system that concentrates wealth and power in the hands of the elites, right? Industrialization and economic growth has not created jobs, right? And unemployment is a reality. Mainstream development has also created a world system based on the exploitation of labor, right? We are talking about jobs today, skills development and whatnot, but look at the transformations that are happening in the world of work. There's informalization, casualization, and externalization of labor, which makes labor very cheap, right? Because companies are trying to cut down on labor costs, so they're circumventing labor laws and restructuring employment, right? That's why today we have the so-called working poor, people who are working but they have nothing to show for it, right? They are stuck in careerless jobs, they are stuck in jobs that have no security, contract jobs, part-time jobs, internships, and so forth, right? So mainstream development is very hard to defend at this point, especially in the South African context, because it has not delivered on the promise of development, right? Mainstream development has disempowered people and the masses, and treating them as passive recipients of development. What do I mean by this? Or what does Islam mean by this? It simply means that development is formulated and implemented by the government and the private sector. They are the ones who spearhead development under neoliberal development, right? And we do not participate in economic policies. We can fool ourselves and say, well, we vote. And the people that we put in power will make policies, and they're accountable to us. But we all know, right now we have a GNU that none of us, when we voted, actually wanted, right? Now this is now negotiations between political elites, and the policies that are going to come out of that have nothing to do with our, interests as the masses, right? So also the idea that development is implemented from above, right? The partnership between the government and the private sector. It means that all of us, as the masses, right, we can only watch these policies implemented, right? We don't have much say, right? We are treated as passive recipients of development rather than as active, producers of our own development. So we don't have much say in terms of economic policy and implementation. All right, so due to these failures, development scholars, community activists, practitioners are searching for possible alternatives to the mainstream development. And this is happening organically in our communities. Wherever you see, in fact, the idea of social movements, community protests, right, is instructive of how much people are actually, fed up with development that is actually, brought to them, but it's in the name of development, but it's actually not development, right? So they're actually yearning for something different. They're experimenting with their own community-driven development. We have many communities that are up in arms with corporations, with banks, with the government, right? I've given you an example of the Mpondo Revolt, which actually started way back in, for those who know the history, from the 1950s to 1990s with the Gumtree Rebellion, now the Tolo Beni mining saga. They are resisting and they say, this is the development we want, not your development, right? So there are many examples of community resistance, right? There are many social movements, for the landless, movements for anti-privatization movements and anti-eviction movements. They are all rejecting this idea of top-down development, and they are in favor of community-driven, localized kind of solutions. So you can read the DVET reading, 2011, which explains why the government is at loggerheads with the communities in the Mpondo Land Wild Coast. And you can also read the Ansari reading. It talks about how people are actually resisting neoliberal development impositions. So this new development experiences include, but not limited to, diverse economies. I'll give you an example. The Mpondoland people, right? We're saying that we don't want mining, right? We are okay with our own traditional livelihood strategies and ecotourism, right? So they have their own model of development, right? And it works for them because it's shared development. They own their land, right? And their development is an expression of their cosmovisions, their religion, culture, and everything. They even say that we don't own the land owns us, right? Yes. So that's an example of economies of difference or diverse economies. It's not capitalist, but it's a different, yes, and it's sustainable environmentally. We all know what mining does, right? We all have been to mining towns like in Velkom, in Rustenburg, right? After the shelf life of the mining, what happens? Cyanide poisoning, pollution, land that has been rendered unusable, right? Is that development? It's not sustainable, right? We've got other examples, including community development, which actually began in the 1980s, because communities were saying, power to the people, nothing about us without us. The World Bank and other institutions started writing about participatory development after realizing that communities are pushing back and saying, we need to be at the forefront of our own development, right? We've got other socialist alternatives. I'm sure some of you who read widely, you know about the Zapatistas in Mexico, right? They fought a civil war with the Mexican government and said, we should be, I'm not advocating for secessionism and saying the Western Cape should be, right? But I'm saying that they actually realized that for them to develop in their own right, and develop sustainably, they needed to actually have local structures, right? So they ceased to be part of the Mexican government, and they're a socialist community, and they actually were off without the intercession of the national government. We've got indigenous knowledge and practices. There are many examples of indigenous knowledge and practices when it comes to development. It's indigenous, it's primitive, backward, but it actually delivers on the promise of development, because that's what the development people want, right? And so there are many examples that I could talk about, but these development alternatives then should not only be seen as an alternative knowledge and development approach, but as a domain of knowledge, theory, and practice, among others. At this juncture, we should not be actually referring to them as alternatives, but we should be talking about development as a multiplicity of ideas and models, right? Like a menu. When you go to a restaurant, you've got a menu of development, and you can choose which development to pursue, depending on your needs as a local community, right? So basically, that's why we say development is a contested discourse. There are competing models and narratives and discourses about what development is and what it ought to be. So development remain contested discourse, and practice and new development experiences are abound, including in South Africa. And this development experience, I'm calling them also alternative development or development from below. By development from below, we are talking about participatory local democracy, where the people themselves are actually the writers of their own development. They decide, they participate at every level, right, of development. And if we are really, genuine about empowering local communities, this alternative development from below really help towards actually bringing democracy to the local level. Right? So these alternatives promote people's freedoms, self-determination, and they promote local democracy and inclusive development, and are participatory, localized, and fosters self-reliance. We have treated our people as passive recipients of development handouts, right? That's why we have this culture of entitlement today, where people expect the government. But actually, there are many local resources that can be harnessed for local development. But we as development experts, we should be able to facilitate development, to engage with these communities, to help them understand that actually some of the things that you are asking for from the national government are locally available. You can do it yourself, right? Yes. They ensure environmental sustainability and sustainable livelihoods. They make development projects beneficial for the local communities. Again, I'm coming back to the mining communities. Today in South Africa, mining communities are amongst the poorest of the poor communities. Some mining towns are ghost towns today, after the shelf life of the mine is over, right? We all know Marikana, we all know, in Velkom and Rustenburg, all these mining towns are poor. Where are the benefits, or rather the profits realized on the JSE and the stock exchange in Wall Street or in the British Stock Exchange, right? But the locals, they have nothing to show for their own resources. But if we pursue a development from a below approach, the profits are realized by the locals themselves. It seeks to change the top-down development practice that exploit, dominate, and maintain control and supremacy over the people. And also, these approaches to development are against cultural imperialism promoted by the Western mainstream neoliberal development. Because development today, right now we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution. We're talking about technologies, right? Invented in the Silicon Valley and in Southeast Asia, right? These are cultural goods that we're actually consuming, right? In more ways than one, right? So it promotes cultural imperialism. So these are the reasons why I'm arguing that we need to move, rather we need to imagine development differently. We need to start thinking about how development can be much more sustainable. And these developments from below are quite promising, and therefore the role of engaged scholars becomes very important in actually intellectualizing these developments, bringing to the fore in the mainstream academia, and therefore we can actually have a much livable future. That's my argument. So the pedagogy of engaged scholarship, as I said earlier on, is nothing new, right? I'm not going into more detail about this. I think I made this point earlier on, right? It's as old as sociology, and sociology is among the oldest social science discipline. So this applies not only to sociology but to development anthropology or cultural anthropology. It applies to development economics as well, right? I think it applies to every other discipline, because the point of studying society, of understanding society, is to change it. There's a question that I will pose for you guys at the end of this presentation, but anyway, let me not preempt there. But the idea is to change society. So if we are development experts or sociologists or anthropologists, we should actually play an active role towards promoting socioeconomic development. And this calls into question conformist mainstream education. Should we conform to the mainstream narrative and mainstream theories and development narratives, or should we have the guts to actually challenge it and propose alternatives that we have every reason to think they are much more possible and actually ushers in a much more livable society, an equitable society, right? All right, so there are many community activists, development practitioners, scholars that believe that it may help create a space that would allow imagining an alternative to development, or to envisage the so-called development from below. This development alternative then should not only be seen as an alternative knowledge system, but actually part and parcel of a menu of development models. I think I made this point earlier on as well. However, these knowledges and systems and practices are relegated to the fringes of mainstream academia. Sometimes if I talk about indigenous knowledge and practices, people wonder, what is that? We've moved beyond that. We are now, doing everything based on the scientific method, right? It's unintelligible for many people. It's unthinkable, actually, that, indigenous knowledge and practices could be, a form of development, and development that is progressive for that matter. Because we are all, there's an international convergence towards neoliberal development, right? Yes. Communities are largely seen as unsophisticated enough to spearhead their own development. We have a contempt for communities. We think that they are uneducated, they are too primitive, traditional to actually, develop themselves, right? But actually emerging research on development from below is actually showing that communities, no matter how seemingly unsophisticated, poor, They actually have their own understanding of development, and in many cases, actually sustainable development. Let me give you an example. I grew up in rural Zimbabwe, and there were many mountains. I grew up in the mountains as well, herding cattle in the mountains. And there were mountains, rivers, and forests, which were a no-go area for us, right? Why? Because our gods, our spirits, our ancestors live there. What are the implications of that for environmental sustainability, right? But for someone, at face value, this is primitive, backward, African, whatnot, right? All the other, negative connotations that comes with that. But actually, it's simple, in terms of dealing with environmental problems, because we allow the forests to replenish, we allow the fish in the rivers to replenish, right? It's simple development. It might be unsophisticated, but it does the trick as far as, right? Something that many people who are part and parcel of the climate change movement and whatnot, and they do conferences across the board, right? They're wasting money to travel and even burning a lot of fuel going into conferences. But the solutions are very simple, and some of them are actually traditional and indigenous. But we have actually neglected this knowledge in the mainstream academia because we think that it does not neatly fit into the scientific model of knowledge, right? So, so this alternative practice needs to be brought to the fore, right? Into the mainstream academia, and it's the role of the engaged scholars who need to work with communities to understand what development means from the community's perspective. All right. I think I have 5 minutes to wrap up this discussion. So I'm not going into the nitty-gritties of what community engaged scholarship is. There's quite a lot of research on this, a lot of models, but simply there are 2 dimensions to community engaged scholarship, right? In terms of teaching and learning, our curriculum, right, must provide for those opportunities and mechanisms for our students to engage with communities, to explore and discover hidden, right, and previously neglected knowledge, systems, and practices, and bring them to the fore, right, to the mainstream academia, right? Then the other aspect is to actually work with communities, facilitate development in communities. There are a lot of scholars who have done that, but I don't think we are doing enough in terms of actually working hand in hand with communities, facilitating development in communities in a way that helps the communities to actually be the drivers of their own change, rather than us dictating to communities what development is and ought to be, right? So, research by Cornell Hart from UWC and others actually shows that many universities have institutionalized and operationalized community development, but institutionalized not only community development, but community engagement, right? But in actual practice, we still have a long way to go, right? You'll see that research also shows that there are a lot of scholars who have been engaging with communities, but it remains ad hoc and it depends on a few leftist radical scholars who are actually religiously following community engagement scholarship. All right, so I just thought, let me give you examples of some of the promising indigenous knowledge and practices. The concept of Buen Viva, which is a Bolivarian, South American, philosophy and way of life, where family and community is above everything, right? It's pretty much the equivalent of our own Ubuntu or Ubuntology. I was taught by Dr. Chiwoza Bandawe, when I was doing psychology at UCT a few years ago. There was a module called Ubuntology. I'm actually remembering this, right? There's so much promise because when it comes to Buenve and Ubuntology, the essence of life, right, is understood in a framework of togetherness. If we religiously follow this as a principle of development, we wouldn't be stuck with poverty and inequality, because everyone will be showed up, everyone will benefit. But we are in a neoliberal capitalist survival of the fittest kind of environment, right? It's a competitive environment, right? We are all told, you have to fight. You have to be on top. On top of who? Other people's children, right? Other people's heads, right? So your development is based on the disenfranchisement of other people. That's what neoliberal capitalism. And we shouldn't be surprised today that there are massive inequalities and poverty is rife in our communities because it's a competitive environment, right? So despite its institutionalizing and operationalizing in higher education institutions, community-engaged scholarship in support of development alternatives and development from below remains shallow and ad hoc. We are not doing enough. I'm still doing a lot of desktop research to find out what's happening in various institutions in South Africa, and I hope this will turn into an opinion piece that I can publish. So this is still work in progress. Okay, so basically, this is what my preliminary, desktop research is telling me, that there is an impetus out there in the higher education, sector in South Africa, but it's just that we are not religiously, actually pursuing community-engaged scholarship, and we are actually just beginning to realize that, we need to reimagine development and actually bring to the fore development from below. Development that has been relegated to the fringes in the mainstream academia and mainstream development. Okay, so I'm not going to say a lot of things, but basically, community engagement scholarship, it's about the voices, the interests, and the felt needs of the communities, right? We quite often have a condescending attitude on communities. We think that communities don't know what they are doing, and therefore we sit in our offices as economists, as development planners, and then we tell them what poverty is, for example, right? Right now, if I ask you how does the South African government measure poverty, define and measure poverty, it's income poverty, right? But some people actually don't really need income. They don't even need money. I remember, going into the countryside, I saw some people for a whole month, they don't even have a cent, but they are living a fulfilling life. They are well fed. They are going to school, right? Because they provide for themselves. They live off the land, right? So that's a different development trajectory, right? But we have contempt for that. We dismiss that because it does not fall squarely within the scientific method of, it does not fit into what we consider a scientific knowledge of development. So community engagement, engaged scholarship in the context of alternative development focuses on how the prevailing socio-cultural traditions and practice, rather the cosmovisions of the people, right, of the local community could be a potential source of sustainable development alternatives. And we have seen with emerging development narratives and practices that actually it's possible, but it's our role as engaged scholars to intellectualize that. Okay, so in South Africa, in conclusion, I can say that the time is ripe in South Africa for many scholars to be bold enough to challenge mainstream. I know for many people, they are afraid to be outliers, right? And that's why conformist education actually thrives at the expense of critical sociological knowledge of our society. So, but the time is ripe because the communities are up in arms with the powers that be, with the government and the private sector, and they're demanding alternatives. But we are failing as academics, as students, as scholars, to actually read the mood and actually engage these communities and work with them through engaged scholarship towards sustainable development alternatives. There are examples. I know one of my mentors at UCT, Dr. Jonathan Grossman, he worked very well with domestic workers. He worked very well with labor movements, right? And for that reason, he was actually an outcast in the department. Much of his publication were thrown into the dustbin because they were seen as unscientific. He had a lot of, actually it made a huge dent on his career. He was never a full professor because his approach to academia in the context of domestic workers and labor movement was actually seen as not sociological, right? So, well, that's the price that we pay as academics. Either you conform or
finish.
Exactly. So, but a lot of scholars now are actually, bold enough to actually engage with communities and critique the mainstream development narratives. There is Professor Jacques Divet at UCT as well. He wrote extensively on the Mpondoland Wild Coast, the Kolobeni saga, and he actually, is one person who actually religiously, promotes, development from below, community-driven development. There are other scholars like, Dr. Samir Ismail. I think she did quite a lot of research on the Victorian housing project, which was very successful, driven by unemployed women, right? They successfully built houses, low-cost houses, through saving schemes, right? This is a promising development model, although it has not been replicated to a large scale. But actually, it shows that actually, communities, when capacitated, they can actually develop on their own terms, right? There are many scholars today. For example, one of the activists, Dr. Trevor Mbani, is now, I think, with the UJ. He said he was an ANC councillor and he revolted against the city of Johannesburg's policy to introduce prepaid water meters and prepaid electricity meters as a cost recovery mechanism for Eskom and the water bodies, right? And he was actually excommunicated from ANC, and he became an academic. Today he works with social movements. He publishes for social movements. He does research with social movements, and that's the kind of engaged scholarship we are talking about, right? Yeah. So this new development experience and grassroots movements enable marginalized communities to exercise collective agency and to invoke positive, inclusive social change, right? However, these new development experience and development alternatives remain relegated to the fringes of academia, particularly social sciences, and this new development experience provides an opportunity for community-engaged scholars, scholarship in pursuit of sustainable, inclusive development. I think I still have one more slide, the last one. Okay, so we need a community-engaged scholarship that critiques mainstream ideas, mainstream development for what it is, right? And that requires us to ditch the conformist kind of approach to education where we are told what we are told and then we just accept these narratives. We need to be critical social, or rather critical sociologists who are able to actually boldly show that the emperor is naked. Indeed, he is naked, and without fear and favor. We should be able to actually challenge mainstream ideas and actually usher in new and sustainable development alternatives. So deploying community-engaged scholarship in support of and in pursuit of sustainable alternatives has been a pedagogical practice in the social science, but it remains ad hoc. We need to do more on that. The community-engaged scholarship pedagogy, or rather the community-engaged scholarship or pedagogy, should be rooted in a deep respect for the prior indigenous knowledge, experiences and practice of grassroots communities and social movements and other community partners. And yeah, so what we understand the challenge that our communities are facing, right? But our understanding in most cases is at loggerheads with the needs of the community. So we need to create platforms through which the voice of the community members are heard, and communities are co-creators of their own development. Communities are the drivers of their own change. Lest we will have issues with the communities like today, right? At some point South Africa was considered the protest capital of the world, right? We had a lot of movements, from the Fallist movement and many other popcorn movements. It's precisely because the policies, the structures created by the government are at loggerheads with the needs of the communities. I think with that being said, my presentation comes to an end. And I know I said a lot of provocative, I made a lot of claims, but I will welcome any questions that you have.
Okay, I'm going to be provocative, if that's fair.